by Jose, so if there's anything that you don't like, please address it to him. And again, I don't have any financial disclosures, but you should know the bias of your speaker. And I told you I didn't like nephrologists. Well, I don't like endocrinologists either. They're not there with those low birth weight babies that are going to develop diabetes. They're not there with the fat teenagers with fat parents trying to get them to slim down. And they're certainly not there at 2 o'clock in the morning with a 4-year-old patient who we are treating an infarct and diagnosing diabetes. So we've already gone over these laws of biology, so I want to not spend a great deal of time of it, but one is physics and chemistry has to obey. Number 2 is entropy, which is really underutilized in our treatment of biology. The cell is the fundamental unit. 4 is the environment, which is a very influential effect on diabetes, one of the causes of it. And then 5 is the inflammatory system, which is both beneficial. And then the 6 is electromagnetic information transfer, which we didn't mention very much about. And I saw Dr. Annunzio was here earlier, but I wanted to go back to day 1 of the Wolfram syndrome and try to apply laws of biology to that particular syndrome. So that's a syndrome where they have diabetes, but not ketoacidosis, optic atrophy, cerebellar atrophy. So, and there's genetic markers. So there's an abnormality to the cell. But what is, I think, abnormal in this is the electromagnetic transfer. And I think it was very appropriate. The speech right after her was given by Dr. Zhao on the zebrafish. And if you remember those beautiful pictures that she showed of budding neurons going out into the tissue. So what I imagine with Wolfram syndrome is that that budding neuron quits. And so there's denervation of the pancreas, the islet cells, and so you get an inadequate glucose response. The same reason you get the optic atrophy and the cellular degeneration. And so I'm going to task Dr. Zhao to find out why those develop knockouts, to see why those things don't branch, why the neurons don't branch. And then she needs to figure out how to get them to branch. And then you can solve Wolfram syndrome. So the laws of biology represent empirical facts. It's a top-down view of biological systems. And I know the basic scientists always use the bottom to the top, and we'll address that. So this is the new model of health and disease, and we got regenerative forces and degenerative forces, and that can be calculated by measuring the number of circulating stem cells. We also have inflammation, which is can pivot at different points, move laterally, so that it can either be beneficial in improving regeneration, or it can be detrimental, causing degeneration. So an alternative approach to these fundamental laws, since no one uses fundamental laws, is the approach of systems theories. But this becomes significantly unmanageable as you start to see charts with enzyme reactions, and it becomes really untenable. And so what I'd like to propose is that we work that way, but do a top-down visit and to see exactly where we're looking at. So that in Wolfram syndrome, we could be looking at nerve bud regeneration as a possible etiology for that syndrome. So how do we apply this to diabetes? Well, this develops a number of hypotheses. Insulin in excess, insulin resistance. And we use that term, everyone uses that term like we understand what that is. It's a proliferative hormone that promotes abdominal obesity, lipid infiltration, blood vessels, hypertension, and is a precursor to cardiovascular events. So it works on the proliferative side. It is a regenerative type of hormone. Allostasis is an innate drive for energy storage, and this clashes with the modern invention of easily accessible carbohydrates. This drive for increased calorie consumption and reduced calorie output introduces noise into the metabolic control loops, resulting in obesity and inflammation from excess fat. And then thirdly, the microcosm of bacteria, which outnumber us 10 to 100 per 1, is influenced by dietary intake, as by our last speaker, and mainly carbohydrates, and it's one of the inflammatory triggers that promotes insulin resistance. Now, we've known about diabetes mellitus type 1 since the time of the Egyptians. The Indians are responsible for developing a diagnostic tool, which was observing flies around urine, going to the sweetness of the urine, a little better than tasting it. And then Minkowski pancrematized dogs and observed that the urine of the dogs also attracted flies, and so that's where diabetes 1 came from. And then Banting and Best discovered and isolated insulin. So I point out that insulin is a proliferative hormone. So if we look at this young boy in his mother's arms on the right, he is devastated. He is degenerative because of the lack of insulin. And we don't see children like this before, but insulin was a starvation disease. And then he gets his insulin replaced and he plumps back up. So insulin is proliferative. Here's another example of a young girl with insulin deficit, and then when insulin is replaced, it causes proliferation and she grows normally. Now, diabetes mellitus type 2 wasn't described until 1936 by Harold Percival Hemsworth, and he noted that there was sweetness of the urine, but there was an excess of insulin and not a deficit, and this is where insulin resistance came from. So diabetes mellitus 2 is a proliferative disease. And why is it proliferative? The environmental influences of the light bulb, easy to obtain carbohydrates, decreased physical activity, has all caused our environment to change. So epidemiology would suggest that the incidence of this disease is exploding, and it's really correlated to our lifestyle. So insulin resistance. Even though the beta cells produce insulin, higher levels of insulin are required to maintain normal glucose levels, either due to a block of the cell insulin receptor, perhaps by an inflammatory protein, lack of the receptor. The insulin produced is non-functional due to extra binding because of an inflammatory protein, failure of self-assembly. This is all imaginary. I don't know that we can show that any one of them is true. But if we look at insulin compared to growth hormone, it looks very much the same on the molecular level. So insulin, although it may have certain aspects of it blocked so it doesn't control insulin, can still cause proliferation. So insulin exhibits growth hormone-like properties, qualifying it to be a proliferative or regenerative hormone. So the metabolic syndrome has several defining features, including abdominal obesity, atherogenic dyslipidemia, elevated blood pressure, insulin resistance manifested by glucose intolerance, pro-inflammatory and pro-thrombotic states. The agreed outcome of metabolic syndrome is cardiovascular disease, and that's why new drugs for diabetes should have an improvement in cardiovascular endpoints. So the mechanisms of abnormal metabolic regulation. Diabetes 1. Well, it involves islet cell death, and this could be an inflammatory destruction. It could be failure to generate a stem cell, or it could be denervation, as I propose occurs in Wolfman syndrome. Diabetes 2, we have early insulin resistance. And there, the abnormal insulin may not be cleaved. Abnormal insulin has extra binding. Insulin receptors blocked. Insulin receptors not produced. So what we do is we eat food. We make insulin. The cells resist the insulin. Sugar stores as fat. We feel tired and hungry, so we eat more food. So then in diabetes 2, we can develop a late form where we actually have insulin deficiency. So the inflammatory process that has begun eventually affects the islet cells, and we also have islet cell death. So we have insulin resistance and we have islet cell death. And then I propose that in diabetes 1, which should not have insulin resistance, some of those individuals do, requiring more and more insulin, likely for the same reason of either the islet cell being blocked, some inflammatory protein interfering with the communication of the cell, giving normal glucose control. So let's go through the different laws and balance regeneration and degeneration and see what the abnormalities are. So first we'll start with Law 3, the cell is the fundamental unit of biology. So under regeneration, insulin is a proliferative hormone. And so it's going to cause neovascularization of the retina, basement membrane in the kidney thickens, vessels become stiffer because they're infiltrated by lipids, abdominal fat increases, your abdominal circumference increases, all under the proliferative effects of insulin. The result is you get retinopathy, nephropathy, abdominal obesity, hypertension, and adipose-mediated inflammatory increases. Degeneration. So circulating stem cells decrease later in the stage of metabolic syndrome. So if you don't have stem cells going out and replenishing your endothelium, you're going to be more likely to have myocardial infarctions and strokes because of the lack of repair. Law 4, the cell must be in homeostasis with the environment. Well, for regeneration, if we take in more calories through the diet, we get uncontrolled growth of bowel organisms. That increases inflammatory response because we have to fight those organisms back down. Excessive consumption leads to surplus energy. It's stored in the body as abdominal fat and in vessel walls. The result is we have an immune inflammatory response, obesity, stiff blood vessels, hypertension, and insulin resistance. If we starve, we can resolve all of those issues. We're going to reverse model blood vessels, hypertension will get better, abdominal obesity gets better, lipid profile gets better, and then we suffer less cardiovascular effects. But starvation is not appealing to our patients. Law 5, there must be a distinction between self and environment. Regeneration, senile or damaged cells are replaced, growth is assisted, the organism is protected from environmental invaders. The result is we have rejuvenation, growth, protection from the environment. However, if we have excessive inflammatory response due to tissue death, overproduction of cytokines, inflammatory proteins, this is going to interfere with regulatory proteins. The result is insulin resistance, prothrombotic state, pro-inflammatory state, and increased cardiovascular incomes because of those conditions. And then finally, 6 is electromagnetic information is necessary for development and regeneration. Regeneration in the embryo, the neurotube develops early on. I don't think we understand why, but it's necessary, and we think that it causes differentiation of cells, causing tissue identity to be preserved by the nerves. So the central nervous system controls both homeostasis and allostasis. The result is we got health, growth, repair, proper differentiation is achieved. If we denervate, then we can only have atrophy. We lose islet cells, have endothelial dysfunction, central nervous system loses control. So here's a homeostasis as opposed to allostasis. So homeostasis is closed loop, and it works very nicely if you have no noise in the system. If you have inflammatory noise in the system, then you can have problems. So let me give you an example, because the first project that I worked on had to do with a closed loop system. It happened to be the control stick of an F-16. So the F-16 was the first aircraft that was fly-by-wire. It was all electronic, and so it would sense the pilot's input. So the very first time the F-16 taxied down the runway, there were bumps in the runway. They would fed into the control stick as a signal, and eventually the plane started oscillating and the pilot had to take off because he was getting unstable. So my job was in the vibration environment to figure out what was causing that oscillation. So it was noise. It was noise from the runway entered into the control loop. So in our bodies we have homeostasis, but if we add noise into that system, that can cause deleterious things. And allostasis is one way we cause noise. We didn't have abundance of food. And so if we saw something that was not quite appetizing, we had to eat it because we knew that starvation was coming. So allostasis is what adds that inflammatory noise into the system. So this is allostasis prior to 1936. You see food, you eat food, then you have famine. This is allostasis after 1936. You see food, you eat food, you prepare for famine, but famine doesn't come. So we get this proliferative state of diabetes mellitus. So in allostasis, the central nervous system anticipates future starvation, overrides satiety to store enough energy for future use. It's an open loop system that drives calorie consumption. Fat stores increase and are inflammatory, protect from environmental exposures, cold, viruses, and bacteria. Inflammation is good to survive environmental exposures. So where does the inflammation originate? So the human organism consists of 500 to 100 trillion cells, 300 cell types. The human organism is host to an additional 500 to 1,000 trillion single-celled organisms, and immunity has to protect itself from that environment. The major portals of this environment is respiratory, gastrointestinal, and the integument. So we've got ugly bacteria in us, but we also have got good bacteria. And the key is, how can we have good bacteria and not be overwhelmed by bad bacteria? And our dietitian is to blame because she hasn't figured this out yet. So I always like to put blame on people. So inflammation's detrimental role. Byproducts of the inflammatory response can affect proteins that regulate blood pressure, metabolism, glucose, lipids, and temperature. Bacteria do not kill the host. The over-responsive inflammatory system kills the host. Chronic inflammation leads to all chronic diseases. So if we look at coronary disease, allostasis, excess insulin stores lipids in the blood vessel walls, increases stiffness, causing hypertension. Excess of fat, bad intestinal flora, environmental hazards cause chronic inflammatory state. The immune system reacts to cholesterol-filled macrophages, and the resulting inflammation thins the fibrous cap of a plaque, making it vulnerable to rupture. The inflammatory response and clotting system are intertwined, making a direct link to coronary artery thrombosis. So some of the milestone papers, I think, goes back to Hemsworth, where he described diabetes 2. I think that we owe a lot to the Korean soldiers who were found to have significant amount of atherosclerosis. 77% of them had greater than 50% blockage in their coronary arteries at autopsy. And that told us that atherosclerosis, it told me, because I'm a minority, it told me that atherosclerosis is not a disease. It's a storage process, and the disease process is chronic inflammation. And then Hafner demonstrated that the vascular disease begins decades before the glucose ever goes up. And so I wonder why my endocrinology colleagues don't obtain fasting insulin levels on someone who comes in with hypertension and abdominal obesity and initiate some type of therapy. And the therapy might be diet, exercise, maybe metformin. So we're getting near the close, but I wanted to emphasize, because this is Jose's, I think, love, is looking at the inflammatory aspect of the adipose. So when you have excess nutrition, we gain calories into that adipocyte, and it causes increased inflammation, and also causes storage into blood vessels, atherosclerosis. Once the inflammation flares over into the blood vessel, then we have clinical events. So this particular study confirmed that coronary disease is a storage process, and inflammatory diabetes accelerated cardiovascular events. So how do we treat diabetes 2? Low inflammatory diet. To prevent gastrointestinal tract from overreacting, producing cytokines that cause insulin resistance, a high-fiber diet, I think, helps with rapid transit to the bowel, accompanied by low carbohydrates and plant protein intake. It seemed to be the least immunogenic, but I don't know that. Exercise. Exercise increases the number of stem cells and prevents the degeneration that occurs during the later stages of diabetes. It also helps bowel motility and reduces inflammation to prevent inflammatory cytokines from blocking insulin receptors. Exercise can utilize insulin to proliferate muscle instead of fat. Weight loss decreases sleep apnea, improves hypertension and inflammation. It's an apoptotic process that inhibits the proliferative effects of excess insulin. So glucose, I don't think, is a good marker for diabetes 2. because you missed the boat by 15 years. And our drugs that we use to treat glucose, I'm not so sure is the best marker. So I think if I was going to design a drug, I would like to have a drug that does not change circulating stem cells. I would like to see hCRP reduced. I would like to see the weight of the patient reduced. I'd like to see the fasting insulin levels reduced. I'd like to see the Th1, Th2 lymphocytes shifted towards Th2, and the bowel flora shifted to whatever the good bacteria are, and we have to rely on our microbiologists to tell us what those bacteria are, and our nutritionists to tell us how to eat to get there. But I don't think glucose is a good marker. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude this talk and ask for any questions.